Now, Professor Alan Lucas from England will talk about nutrition and brain. What is the effect of nutritional status, nutrition deficiency, nutrition supplementation for the development and the growth of our brain?
Thank you very much for inviting me from this beautiful city. I'm going to talk about early nutrition and long-term neurocognitive outcomes. Now, a key underlying concept here is neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to be modified by environment, such as nutrition. In fact, this is a process that can occur throughout the life course, but I'm going to focus on very early life, the most sensitive period. And I want to explore with you two key areas that will underpin our practice: undernutrition and breastfeeding. Now, with regard to undernutrition, there have been decades of observations that show that malnourished infants have lower IQ. But causation was never proven. That could have all been due to associated poor environment, poverty, or lack of stimulation. So our largest randomized trials were initiated to test experimentally whether nutrition can program the brain. And we started in the 1980s on around 1,000 premature babies. Now, even in neonatology, the relationships between early nutrition and growth and later development are dominated by observational studies. In a recent review, Olm identified 35 observational studies in which neonatal weight gain or head circumference growth were positively linked to later neurodevelopment. But in that review, there were very few randomized trials, and our neonatal trials were virtually the only ones with long-term cognitive outcomes. We've now studied these babies for over 30 years, and we're studying our 30-year follow-up at the moment. Now, these randomized trials add weight to the extensive observational data on nutrition in the brain. And so I'm going to take you on an adventure into the evidence from our preterm trials to start with, to provide proof of principle that's relevant to nutrition in all infants. Now, our 4 trials comprise donor breast milk with preterm formula as sole diets or as supplements to mother's milk, and a term formula versus preterm formula as sole diets or supplements to human milk. And I want to start by considering this trial, term formula versus preterm formula. These are babies whose mothers had chosen not to provide breast milk, and they were randomly assigned to a standard formula, which was being used in those days, or a nutrient-enriched preterm formula for about an average of a month. Head circumference gain was 28% lower with what we now know is a suboptimal term formula, and that's a very large effect on the volume of the brain. So we then measured IQ at 7 to 8 years, and you can see that those who are fed on a suboptimal term formula have a significant reduction in overall IQ, accounted for by this 13-point reduction in verbal IQ. And this was a fact that was most seen in males. Recently, we've done a mechanistic analysis here and shown that it's protein intake rather than calorie intake that drives later verbal IQ. Well, we've also shown that babies who are fed suboptimally on a standard term formula have a major subsequent increase in motor or mental impairment, including an increased risk of cerebral palsy. And our theory for the cerebral palsy is that if you have a perinatal brain insult and then you're fed optimally, you have a chance to repair and remodel the brain, whereas if you have poor nutrition, you may go on to develop cerebral palsy. So just 4 weeks of intervention with 20% lower protein intake caused a major lasting reduction in IQ and an increase in impairment. Now, do these cognitive effects persist into adolescence or early adult life? Well, here I want to show you all 4 of our clinical trials where we're comparing diets that we now know are suboptimal, that is, diets containing unfortified donor breast milk or a standard term formula, versus enriched diets that contain a preterm formula. And we followed babies who were born less than 30 weeks gestation. You can see here that verbal IQ in 8-year-old preterm born males and females was 6.7 points lower in those who are fed suboptimally during the neonatal period. And this has persisted into adolescence, nearly 7 points loss in verbal IQ in the previously suboptimally fed group. The greatest effect was in verbal comprehension index, 7.4 points lower in those fed suboptimally. Verbal comprehension index is a measure of the ability to express oneself and to apply reasoning to information presented verbally. And it's perceived as brightness, which is an important thing, for instance, for employment potential. Now, these long-term adverse effects of undernutrition also affected outcomes not included in routine IQ tests. Those fed suboptimally in the neonatal period had poorer educational attainment as they got into adult life, with worse reading and arithmetic scores, and planning ability, which is an important everyday skill, was significantly reduced, 15% lower scores in those fed suboptimally in early life. We've just started to look at motor achievement, and you can see here this is a motor score based on balancing skills, ball skills, and hand skills, and neonatal weight gain drives later motor performance, particularly manual dexterity. So what is the neural basis for these broad effects of early nutrition? So the question here is, how do we study the effects of undernutrition on brain structure in humans in real life? Well, MRI is the most detailed tool that we have, but inspection of individual scans is far too crude. What we do is statistical comparison of groups of scans, for instance, groups fed different diets, and that's much more discerning. So using a variety of MRI techniques, our data suggest that the cognitive effects of early nutrition relate to multiple effects on the underlying structure of the brain. And I want to just give you one example based on the increasing evidence that the size of this large structure, the caudate nucleus, is highly related to IQ. Because we found that the volume of the caudate nucleus was 10% smaller in those who'd been previously fed suboptimally. And that was one of the first demonstrations in humans that early nutrition can permanently affect the structure of the brain. So what further evidence may help define the critical window for the impact of undernutrition on the brain? I want to talk about studies on the impact of fetal growth on cognition. Now, observations show that low birth weight is positively related to IQ, and that would suggest that if you grow poorly as a fetus, you may have some degree of cognitive impairment. But that can be confounded by numerous factors relating to lower birth weight. So we needed to do an experiment, and randomized trials are difficult for the fetus, and so we decided to study monozygous twins, which share genes, parental IQ, gender, and gestation. And we looked at the impact of reduced birth weight on IQ in the smaller twin that was relatively malnourished compared to the larger one as a control. What we found was a highly significant linear relationship between the birth weight difference of each pair and the IQ difference. So, for instance, in twins differing in birth weight by more than 750 grams, there was an 8-point lower IQ in the smaller rather than the larger twin at follow-up. And if we look at twins differing in birth weight by 1,500 grams, there was an entire standard deviation, 15 points lower in the smaller twin. We estimated that a 1 kilogram loss of intrauterine growth potential would triple low IQ scores below 70 from 2.3 to 7.7%. Now, there is a large global incidence of intrauterine growth retardation, and this is an unquantified problem for cognitive potential and educational resources. So, can the cognitive deficit in those that are growth retarded at birth be rescued by postnatal nutritional intervention? Well, we did a trial in small, that is, small for gestational age, but otherwise healthy full-term infants who were randomly assigned to a standard versus an enriched formula with 30% more protein to promote growth and development. Using the Bailey scales, we found no benefit whatsoever for enhanced postnatal nutrition. So theoretically, if there is a window of opportunity for intervention, it may be a prenatal one. So the period prior to full term is a very sensitive one for nutritional programming of the brain, whether you're a fetus or a premature baby. What about randomized trials in full-term infants? These would allow us to test the evidence for a post-term window of nutritional sensitivity. Now, there were 4 classic randomized trials done of nutrient supplementation in frankly undernourished populations. And these trials show lesser cognitive effects in malnourished term infants than seen in preterm infants. So there were effects, but they were somewhat less than we'd expect in interventions prior to full term. So if we plot the sensitivity of the brain to undernutrition, you can see that the greatest period of sensitivity is prior to full term, but the window of sensitivity remains open, at least for the first 2 years of life. And this has major implications for practice, not just for the very sensitive preterm infant, but also the term infant. Now, we can't consider the brain in isolation. We need to also consider cardiovascular risk. And although I've not actually talked about this today, we have a paradox, because we see favorable programming effects of faster growth on the brain, but favorable programming effects of slower growth on later cardiovascular risk. So how do we balance these risks in infant nutrition? Well, prior to full term, the extreme sensitivity of the brain favors faster growth, like the fetus grows fast. But after full term, we now favor slower growth, like the breastfed baby, in order to capture the cardiovascular benefits. Well, I want to talk now about breastfeeding in the brain. Numerous studies and reviews since 1929 show that breast milk feeding is associated with better cognition. But mothers who provide breast milk tend to be more highly educated and exhibit more positive health behaviors. That could highly confound the cognitive outcomes. Now, we can adjust for such confounding factors, such as mother's education. We found that after doing this, mother's milk promoted an 8-point higher advantage in later IQ in babies born preterm. But what we really want to do is to establish causation. Now, randomized trials of human milk versus formula are feasible in preterm infants. I want to take this trial, donor breast milk versus preterm formula. You can see here we're looking at the WISC arithmetic score at 7 to 8. This is of great importance educationally. We're about to publish this, and you can see that it's 27% higher in those fed on unfortified donor breast milk compared to a preterm formula. So whilst good nutrition is important, you can see that in this particular comparison, having human milk was even more important. I'll come back to that later. We also have 2 randomized trials, donor breast milk versus preterm formula, and term formula versus preterm formula, where the mother provided no breast milk at all. And so we've removed the confounding due to mother's choice to provide breast milk. And then in the cross-comparison of these two trials, we can compare banked breast milk and term formula, which are similar from a nutritional point of view, and yet the banked breast milk group has got a 7-point higher score on the Bayley Psychomotor Development Index. The only randomized trial that's been done in term infants is the PROBIT cluster randomized trial in Belarus on over 17,000 subjects, and compared mothers who were actively promoted to breastfeed for longer versus a breastfed control group where they were not actively promoted. And at 6.5 years follow-up, babies of mothers that were promoted to breastfeed longer had a 7.5-point advantage in verbal IQ. Now, these randomized trial data add weight to the observational data, suggesting that breast milk may well benefit later cognition. And these cognitive effects of human milk have focused attention on the structure of the brain itself. We've done MRI studies of the brain on 16-year-olds born preterm, and the percentage of mother's milk in the diet is independently related to white matter volume and to verbal IQ at 16 years follow-up. This has been affirmed by Deone in full-term infants, where white matter volume is positively related to IQ and to breastfeeding. Now, myelin underlies connectivity within the brain. It's a foundation for the development of long-term cognitive function. And we hypothesize that breast milk may permanently benefit cognition, at least in part by promoting myelin formation and white matter growth. So what could further support this hypothesis? Breast milk fats are looking very promising. Just to remind you, the epithelial cells of the breast alveoli produce milk fat globules, and as they're extruded into the milk, they're covered with maternal apical cell membrane. So what you have is a milk fat globule full of triglycerides and a milk fat globule maternally derived membrane that's rich in phospholipids and cholesterol. And this membrane also contains proteins that we now believe have further biological roles. In formulas, cow's milk fat has been thrown away and replaced with a blend of vegetable oils in an attempt to mimic the fatty acids in breast milk. And these vegetable oil blends in modern formulas lack the biological sophistication of milk fat globules. So could the absence of milk fat globule membrane help to explain the advantages of breast milk feeding versus formula feeding for cognition? Well, the milk fat globule membrane has components that could theoretically benefit neurodevelopment, and these factors are lower in formulas than in breast milk and include sphingomyelin, gangliosides, choline, sialic acid, and cholesterol. So to test the hypothesis that milk fat globule membrane could benefit formula-fed infants, a randomized trial was needed. And this was led by Domalov in Sweden with 160 formula-fed babies assigned to formula with and without bovine milk fat globule membrane. And you can see that the formula that contained milk fat globule membrane promoted a half a standard deviation higher Bayley score at 1 year of age compared to the control formula, and was much nearer to the breastfed group. Now, promising individual nutrients from milk fat globule membrane are cholesterol and sphingomyelin. I want to start with cholesterol. There's increasing evidence that cholesterol can drive neural development. Breast milk is rich in cholesterol, and formula has none. In mice, if you increase dietary cholesterol, you increase brain myelinization rate, and if you increase the mother's dietary cholesterol, you can influence the myelinization of her suckling pups favorably. Now, in our randomized trial of bank breast milk versus preterm formula in humans, mean plasma cholesterol during NICU stay was significantly higher in the human milk-fed group. And in this same randomized trial, we found that mean plasma cholesterol was strongly related to neonatal head growth, suggesting that cholesterol might drive the growth of the neonatal brain. So that looks very promising because driving the growth of the brain would be important for neurodevelopment. I want to move on to sphingomyelin. Milk fat globule membrane contains polar lipids, of which 25 to 35% are sphingomyelin, and sphingomyelin metabolites are a key component of myelin itself. So is there evidence that dietary sphingomyelin improves neurodevelopment? Well, in developing rats, sphingomyelin increases axon and nerve fiber diameter and myelin thickness. But what about humans? Well, Tanaka has done a pilot randomized trial in preterm infants and tested if sphingomyelin fortified formula influences neurobehavioral development. You can see that the formula that contains sphingomyelin promoted better infant intelligence scores at 12-month follow-up and also promoted superior scores on the behavior rating scale both at 12 and 18 months. And every single subscale was benefited by sphingomyelin in the formula. So milk fat globule membrane lipids like cholesterol and sphingomyelin may play a key role in cognition and white matter growth and may be a major factor for the higher cognitive function of breastfed babies. So in summary, the overall evidence that breastfeeding affects cognitive development and brain structure is becoming stronger with plausible candidate nutrients. Now, I wouldn't wish to suggest that it was just milk fats that affect brain development in breastfed babies. There are many factors in human milk that could do that. But somewhat futuristically, I'd just like to consider stem cells. Now, 35 years ago, the function of live cells in breast milk was unknown, and I hypothesized that they could colonize the breastfed infant. Well, because we didn't know there were stem cells at that time, in mice, breast milk stem cells pass into the offspring via breast milk, and they persist in multiple organs, including the brain. So if that turned out to be true for humans, which is being actively investigated, mother's genes could be expressed in her breastfed baby, and that could influence brain development and other organs. So this is a very exciting area for the future. I'm often asked by doctors in the Middle East if there could be a biological basis for the kinship bond between mother and her baby that is expressed in Islamic teaching, which of course I'm not an expert on. But clearly, the passage of mother's genetic material into the baby through breastfeeding would in fact be an important biological bond. I've taken you on a rapid journey through what I think is quite an exciting field. Believe it or not, this is me. I still race my motorbike. Now, I want to just summarize with a few messages here. Let's start with the preterm infant. It is critical to meet the nutritional needs of these babies and to promote growth. For extremely low birth weight babies, our data and a wealth of other data show that growth at around 18 grams per kilo per day and around 4 grams per kilo per day help to improve neurodevelopment. Also, human milk turns out to be a major factor for good neurodevelopmental outcome. Well, we've just produced a new statistical model. It's not published yet, but after adjusting for confounders, we found that growth rate and mother's own milk intake have an additive impact on IQ at age 7 to 8. And I want to give you a worked example, but bear in mind that these are preliminary, unpublished evidence that were produced a few weeks ago. If we take babies growing at 18 rather than 10 grams per kilo per day, that's associated with an extra 4 to 6 IQ points. And if you're fed on 100% mother's milk versus no mother's milk, that is associated with a further 6 to 9 IQ points. So that will be a total of 10 to 15 extra IQ points at 7 to 8 years, simply from attending to growth and the amount of mother's milk in the diet. Obviously, this needs to be worked out further. Now, as far as the full-term infant is concerned, randomized trials indicate that malnutrition in term infants adversely affects the brain, but much more subtly than in the preterm infant. We have good evidence that breastfeeding is an important factor for cognitive function and brain development in term infants, and of course, individual nutrients are important in term infants for the brain, and in that context, we should carefully watch the literature on dietary brain lipids, as we might call them, because this is a rather exciting developing area. And finally, my overarching message is that we as health professionals can actually change the clinical and public health outcomes of babies by what we do in practice to produce a lifetime influence on cognition and the brain, which of course is of great importance for the next generation of babies under our care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lucas, for your illuminating talk. My question, did you find in your study difference in the caudate nucleus between sex, girl and boy?
Sorry?
Did you find any difference in the size of the caudate nucleus in sex, boy or girl? No difference?
The size of the brain in a boy or girl?
Yes, size of the caudate nucleus.
Yes. We've found consistently that boys have larger head circumference and therefore larger brains than girls. But this is clearly a part of the brain that's not relevant to cognitive development, because although brain size in general is highly related to cognitive performance at any age, we do know that males and females are very similar in their cognitive development.
Okay, thank you. Next, thank you for illuminating that sphingomyelin and DHA have a factor in myelination. That's why, do you think that babies suffering from hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy with defect in myelin, if I supplement them with DHA and sphingomyelin, the condition can be reversed?
Well, the reversibility of cognitive problems in early life is something that is very new, and it's quite possible that we may be able to rehabilitate the brain really quite well into life. And certain fatty acids and nutrients like DHA have been shown to affect neural regeneration and synaptic modification quite well into life. So this is an important issue. With regard to DHA in infancy, the jury is still out as to whether those lipids favorably affect brain development. Meta-analyses that have been done on a large number of trials on 2 occasions now have failed to show an overall cognitive benefit. But our studies show that the source of LC-PUFA is critically important, and that you can make neurodevelopment significantly better, significantly worse, or have no effect at all, depending on the source. So I think that is important in teasing out causation here. We need to look very carefully on the types of preparation that have been used with LC-PUFA. If I'd had a little bit longer, I would have included LC-PUFA in my talk.
Thank you. Any question from the floor?